Thanks for joining today. I see a bunch of familiar faces. Appreciate that. We are going to talk a little bit about synthetic research. I will say that it's a different vibe already, just seeing that there are a lot of note takers, AI note takers that are in here, which is not something that I would say we've experienced before. But maybe in the world of AI, we ought to expect to be talking to a lot of AIs directly. So thank you for joining. Really, what I think we want to do today is take people on a bit of the journey that we've been through as we have been exploring the opportunities around synthetic research over the last, I don't know, probably 18 months. And some of the lessons that we've learned as we've thought about how best to put it to use for our clients in our business. And hopefully you can take away from that some perspectives as well that will be useful. I will say, don't hesitate to jump in as I go through this. Happy to take questions as we go. And while it's tough to make these things interactive, if you put questions or comments in the chat, I can try and respond to them and make it a little more interactive than it would be otherwise. So let's get rolling. That is not going to help me get rolling. Okay, so first, for those of you who are not familiar with us, we are what we call a language strategy firm. And really everything that we do is founded on this simple idea that it's not what you say that it's not what you say that matters, it's what your audience hears. And that in all the work that we do as a research firm and as a consulting firm, we're trying to understand what it is that our clients are trying to communicate, what are the challenges of communicating that message, and what we can do to reframe, re-articulate that message to find exactly the right words and phrases to make our clients' audiences listen, care, and act. So what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit through the lens of what we focus on in language strategy, because obviously we spend more time thinking about that. But certainly in the beginning of this, the perspectives that we have are more broad-based perspectives about synthetic research in general. And so I'll talk a little bit about what it is that we mean when we talk about synthetic research. What are the opportunities and risks that we have identified in using synthetic research to achieve a whole range of objectives? We've kind of identified 5 questions that we think people should ask before deciding which route to go when it comes to doing synthetic research. And then ultimately some tools that we are using to improve results on the work that we're doing that I think can be applicable for you as well. So let's start just with what is it? But before I tell you what we think it is, just to get a sense of the group, I would love to get your response to this. Chris, if we can load in the chat the first poll question, please. There we go. This is confidential. We will not hold you accountable for this, but please give us a sense of what the answers are to this question. If we can get you to vote. There we go. Starting to get a little bit. All right. If we can, is it showing up in the meeting chat? Maybe. There we go. The responses are showing up in the meeting chat. So most people here know at least a little bit. Some are pretty experienced. I appreciate the one synthetic agent acknowledging that they are in fact a synthetic agent. There are more. That was not anticipated when I wrote the question. But I think this is where most people are, which is that there's a sense now that if you work in a space that is that may benefit from research, that you have read something about this, you know a little bit about it. Some people know enough to be dangerous. There's fortunately nobody who says that they know more than I do, although you don't know how much I know yet, so you may change your mind by the end of this. But I will assume that that we're not dealing with a group of experts on here, and so it does make sense spend a little bit of time of just defining terms. So first one I assume most people are familiar with, which is LLMs, these large language models like ChatGPT, which are the platforms on which all of this AI work is done. synthetic research, as we think about it, is really any type of research that uses an AI-generated persona, a digital twin, an agent, or other audience or descriptive data that that is used instead of real participants. It is as simple as behave like a policy leader, as we'll talk about in a little bit, and then listening to what they say or asking them to respond to something as if they were a particular type of persona, all the way to much more sophisticated AI agents that that I'll show you as we dig into this. When I talk about a persona, it really is that simple version of this. Anytime that you go into an LLM or a chat and kind of define how they are going to respond to you instead of responding to you as you, is some form of a persona. They can be very simple. They can be much more complex with a lot more descriptive text to explain who they are. But that's entirely, that is all the category of personas. Digital twins, I would say, are a more sophisticated version of personas where they are used in places like if you are a CEO or an executive and you create a digital twin, or somebody creates a digital twin of you where they're uploading past speeches, past communications, messages, information about you so that you can kind of replicate yourself, or where from a research perspective, we might create a version of a particular person with lots of information uploaded with background material in order to get a sense of how that person might respond. Again, that can be done at a pretty high level, or it can be done with a whole lot of detail. And then agent-based modeling, which is another concept that we'll talk about, is where we basically create lots and lots of digital twins that reflect an audience that you would otherwise want to do research with, so that instead of doing research with an aggregated audience with like a single digital twin or a representative twin of different audiences, we're doing it with hundreds or thousands of different agents, each of which is a digital twin, and allow us to do research in a way that allows us to collect a lot more data from a lot more respondents and understand the universe of the potential audience in much more sophisticated ways than we can with an individual digital twin. So, first question that certainly we asked at the beginning of this is does this really work? Is it as good as the hype? Should we be afraid of using it or of presenting it to clients? And there is now a lot of hype out there. There are some really interesting and positive use cases, including those that we've had. We've seen there are situations where you can get really dramatic reductions in cost, increases in research productivity and speed, faster research analysis using AI. There's a study, as you see here, that showed 85% accuracy. We've actually seen 90% accuracy in a lot of the work that we've done. We've also seen like a lot of expectation around this, that according to this survey, 71% of researchers said that within 3 years, synthetic responses will make up more than half of data collection. Whether or not we agree with that, how far it's going to go in terms of the kind of research that is done and how much of it uses synthetic responses, the reality is that a lot of research is going to move in this direction, and there is a lot of opportunity. There's also a lot of fear out there, and there are risks that we'll talk about that everyone needs to be aware of before you go into this, so that you can go into it with your eyes open. I think some of the areas where we see it being most prevalent, the things that we need to watch out for the most, are the fact that a lot of these models have been trained on weird markets, Western educated, affluent markets, and so they don't necessarily reflect markets outside of developed European markets, US, et cetera. Foreign language is still a challenge for a lot of the models. That will obviously change over time, but for now, it is still a really difficult challenge to overcome in using these models. There's a bigger picture challenge that will manifest over time, that the more that these models are used to create content or create data that then are used to train the models, the more you get a kind of inception where you're not sure if you're in the real world or a world that is trained on AI. And presumably the results will get further and further away from human responses. And there are definitely a lot of places where the data shows, both the academic literature and our experience shows, that AI is just not ready to replicate the kind of questions that we might be asking. And so what we've tried to find is where between the hype and the fear is the opportunity. And that's what I'm going to spend the most time talking about. Because I think that the opportunities are really broad-based, and they are with people who are researchers on the right end of the spectrum and people who have never done research before on the left end of the spectrum. And so as I think about the kind of people who are looking at synthetic research right now, I'm going to ask you what you are in a second, so pay attention. I think that most people are falling into one of these 5 buckets. And the first is what I would call a first-time researcher. It's actually not a first-time synthetic researcher. It's somebody who works often in the comms department, doesn't necessarily do a lot of research or do research on a lot of the messaging or different strategies that they might be putting into the market. But now they see AI as an opportunity to actually do research in a way that is cost effective and fast, and will therefore use it in ways that they've never used research before. Second group are budget stretchers, people who are pretty well versed in research, see AI as fundamentally an opportunity to lower the costs of doing research or to stretch the research dollar further. AI integrators, I would say, I know that we have many clients where there are mandates from the C-suite that every function needs to be integrating AI more and more into their day-to-day, and that synthetic research becomes a way for these researchers or people in other functions to integrate that AI. Then we get into the more sophisticated buckets, those people who are probably doing research on a regular basis and see AI as a complement, but not yet a replacement for real research with real human beings. And then finally, the innovators, the people who are at the front end of the adoption curve, who are finding those places where actually hybrid can replace traditional research. And so would love to get a sense from you all as to where you fit on the spectrum. If you could put yourself into one of these categories, I would appreciate it. Will give me a sense of how you're looking at this. Nice. Okay, so pretty much across the spectrum, the most people at the hybrid opportunist, I guess, and first timers. That's actually what we're seeing in the market. I would say that there are the people who are using this in ways that they haven't used research before, and the people who are finding ways to complement, expand upon, add to their existing research by doing some synthetic, even as an add-on to human research. And so for all the, in all of these situations, there are going to be a range of use cases. And the question becomes kind of where are the right places to use synthetic? Where is it too risky to do it? And that's what we'll try and jump into in a second. But I want to spend a little bit of time going deeper into what we talked about a little bit when it came to the fear of AI. But these are some research risks that I think it's helpful for people to know as you go into this. Not all of them are going to be relevant in all circumstances, and many of them can be ignored for different use cases. But it is helpful to have an understanding of, where the academic literature and where we have identified risks that are worth paying attention to. And I think they fall really into these 3 big buckets. The first one on the top right are kind of strategic misapplications of the LLMs, of using synthetic research. There are times where when we use the LLMs and they are overfit to the purpose that we are trying to achieve, and basically there's either too much information added to the training of the LLM or of the synthetic personas or twins, where it basically becomes a problem where they just replicate what is being asked, and you don't get a replication of human responses. You get a replication of basically what it is that you've put into the model, and so you've overfit the model to your purpose. You have many places where the LLMs simply deliver responses that have limited understanding or drive misguided decisions. That where they don't have the right information or enough information or the right kind of context in order to effectively give you feedback on the kinds of questions that you're asking. On the bottom right, where there's data integrity and reliability, you've got the model collapse I talked about, where the model kind of continues to kind of turn in on itself because it is creating and being trained on the same sets of data so that it can no longer really distinguish between what the AI is telling it and what humans might be telling it. And then there's also this notion of kind of hyper accuracy distortion, which is where the models are trying to give you such hyper accurate results that it's actually inconsistent with the way humans think. Right? Humans are messy. The models tend to try and be neat in how they give their responses. And so you get these incredibly rational, thoughtful, deliberate responses. They are just not the way that humans actually respond to information. And then you've got this group, which I think is probably the most relevant for us, which is just basic biases that are built into the models that we need to be aware of. And the first one, demographic. I mentioned that a lot of these are trained on white, educated, affluent, developing markets. And so to the extent that we're dealing with people outside of those markets or people that are not even in those markets, that are not that kind of people, either based on race, education, income, otherwise, then there might be a bias in terms of the results that we're going to get. Temporal limitations, if we are, and I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to our 5 questions, the models are trained on a certain data set. That data set does not evolve as quickly as the world does. And so depending on what it is that we are trying to understand, the models may not keep up. They're going to be less good at the latest and newest pieces of information versus things that have been out in the public domain for a much longer time. Cultural bias, not unlike demographic bias, is that we've seen in a lot of the models that they don't have a high degree of cultural sensitivity. And so if we're dealing with issues that have the need for specific knowledge about different cultures, different behaviors from different groups of people, then they are not going to reflect that as well. And the one that we see come up the most, and in some ways the easiest to control for, but often really has a big impact on what we get from research, is confirmation bias or sycophancy bias. And by that we mean the LLMs remarkably really want to please. And so they want to give socially acceptable answers. They want to give positive answers versus negative answers. The humans that we deal with in research on a regular basis tend to be pretty skeptical about the world that we're operating in. The LLMs are much, much less skeptical. And so it becomes really important to understand that and each of these AI risks when we think about the kinds of work that we want to do. And as I said, please jump in if you have questions as we go. But so knowing that there are risks and there are opportunities, the thought process that we went to is to say, can we divide the world into different use cases, or the research world into different use cases, so that we can exclude certain situations from using synthetic AI, synthetic research at all, identify some where the risks that we have identified are not really relevant to what it is that we're trying to do, or can be really easily controlled for. And then the other ones where if we impose the best controls that we can come up with, they become really effective use cases, but they might not otherwise be good use cases if we don't take those steps. And I'll start by the exclusions. You will have seen the theme throughout, in that these LLMs are just not good for doing research with certain people in certain places. And the use cases that I would say are the highest risk and would generally, really stay away from, or certainly not use synthetic research to the exclusion of traditional research. First are, if we're doing foreign language research, it's got to be with humans still. If it's outside of the weird markets, if it's highly culturally specific, then we definitely want to be doing traditional research to understand how humans are going to respond. I think the synthetic research is not going to be super effective if we're talking about something that is brand new, and that brand new could be a brand new issue, a brand new product, particularly in a category that the models may not be familiar with. There are ways, and I'll talk about them, that we can do that if we mitigate some of the risks. But I would say kind of the newer and more different it is, the higher risk it is. Similarly, with new information, if there is a scandal that breaks on the news today, I would not go to synthetic research to be the best tool to understand how the population is going to respond to that crisis. Now, there may be ways of doing it if traditional research, thanks, Bob, human research is what I mean by traditional research versus synthetic. For dispersion of information, if the news is brand new, it may not be in the model yet. Even if you're searching on the web, the way that the model may be trained, first of all, it means that everyone will get the same amount of information unless you train it differently. You just have to be more careful about what information is being used to evaluate really emerging topics or issues, if that's what your goal is. And then there are certain types of research objectives that we think are less appropriate for synthetic research right now. And there are times when we are really trying to explore for something that is highly nuanced or deeply emotional. And it is hard to get to that level of depth and nuance, as you'll see a bit more with synthetic research. There is needle in a haystack research, where you're trying to look for something that is not easy to predict. And for anybody who knows anything about the LLMs, really what they are trying to do is look at the world as it has been, and based on past behaviors, past information, past training, predict what will happen. They are not so good at predicting things that have not happened before. And so if we're looking for something that is really really out of the norm, not the conventional wisdom, not the average, the further away from that we're looking, the less likely synthetic research is going to be to help. And then finally, if we're doing something extremely complex from a methodological perspective, at least for us, we have not really tackled that challenge. It requires a lot more focus and sophistication than we've applied to it yet. Although there are exceptions to that rule. But if you leave behind those really, really high risk use cases, a lot of the things that we do research on today fall into one of these two buckets. And so the bigger challenge, as opposed to kind of eliminating these really high risk use cases, the bigger challenge we think is figuring out, where there are really low risk use cases that you can just go ahead and use the LLM, and where there's a need to do more kind of in how you structure and think about the research in order to get good results. And for that, we've identified these 5 questions that we look at when we are thinking about how to approach this research. So I'll tee them up here, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail on each of them on the next couple of slides. So first is, what stage of development are you? If you're early, brainstorming versus final. Second is, what are the stakes? BAU being business as usual, or is this a bet the company decision? Third is, are we talking about an established topic or something that's really emergent and new? Fourth is the depth of the insight that we are looking for. Is this high-level directional insight, a high-level insight, or is it something really complex that we're trying to dig into? And finally, the output out of this. What are you looking for in terms of the quality of the feedback that you want from the research? Is it directional, or is it really detailed? And so let me explain a little bit more about what I mean by each of these. So stage of development and the decision stakes kind of fall into a similar kind of thought process, even though they're slightly different. So first is, if we're at the brainstorm stage, the AIs can be great, with the caveat that they may not be able to identify ideas that are really brand new. If you're trying to build a group of ideas, if you're trying to use a bunch of different personas or digital twins to do some divergent thinking, to get new ideas, to think in ways that you don't think as an individual, then it's pretty low risk, because those biases may actually be helpful in terms of the outputs that you get. If you're developing concepts, again, if you're trying to build out these new concepts, then or develop content ideas based on a brief, then again, it's pretty low risk. The biases may be helpful, or to some extent they can be countered by how you define the even a simple persona. Message generation as well is for getting new messages, just identifying them, brainstorming on them, very good use of LLMs. And then similarly, like business as usual, I think we always say this from a research perspective, that it's almost always better to have another opinion beyond your own than just your own, particularly from a message perspective. We're rarely trying to persuade ourselves of something. And so just having a gut check or a thought partner can be really valuable. It's pretty low risk because the biases, again, that they might even be helpful. Questionnaire testing, quick tests of things to just get that kind of gut check or directional results can be very effective, low risk uses of these tools. On the higher risk side, I'd say that if you're about to make a big decision, if you are trying to finalize your product claim, trying to get ready to test, which we've been doing a fair amount of, test earnings calls, and make sure that you have as good an understanding of how people are going to respond as possible, then I think there's higher risk. You want to make sure you control for as much as possible. Similarly, for crisis response, with the caveat that the new stuff is going to be more challenging to test with synthetic at all, there are ways to populate the models or the twins with different levels of contextual awareness, so that you can get a read on how different kinds of people are likely to respond. Those are higher risk. We'll talk about how to get those in a second. But so this is the first decision tree. Low risk, we just go with the LLMs. Higher risk, we need to do more work. The other division between low risk and high risk is these established versus emergent topics. If you've got product categories, lifestyle behaviors, brands, customer journeys, issues that you want to explore that have been out there in the public domain for a while, and you want to get feedback on features or new versions of the product, great. Like pretty low risk, given the biases and risks, to use more straightforward prompting. The places that we would want to do more work and mitigate the risk are where it's novel, it's rapidly changing, it's a niche concept, or it's more emotionally complex. The fourth area is around the depth of insight. One of the things that the LLMs do is they provide a pretty aggregated view. They kind of regress to the mean of any persona that you create. And so they are trying to predict, because they're trying to predict the most likely response to any given question, they're going to get the response that the most people, most of the time, are going to come to, or the most synthetic people. They're going to give you kind of a single audience view that is the most stereotypical view of that audience. And sometimes that's great. Sometimes, though, you need a much more nuanced view of things. And you want to understand that that within a given audience, that there's a lot of variation, and that you might want to look at whether it's within the general population, you want to look at men versus women, you want to look at young versus old, you want to look at combinations of those things. The more sophisticated the segments that you want to look at, the more that you are going to want to control for some of the risks, which I will talk to in a second. And the more that you want to do custom analytics, obviously that's just building a more sophisticated engine. I see in the chat there's a question about emotionally complex. I think, again, because the LLMs on their own and digital twins, kind of the relatively simple versions, are going to regress to the mean. If it's not really the mean or the average or the typical or the stereotypical that you're looking for, then you're talking about something where you want an approach that is more complex so that you can gather that emotional complexity, the variance within an audience. And so it really is kind of the predictable in many ways versus the less predictable, or the more varied based on different types of segments that you want to dig within. And then the final piece is what kind of feedback do you want? If you are doing something that is, again, at the brainstorming stage or business as usual, you may just want like conversational feedback. It can be unstructured. You don't necessarily need to understand how that feedback compares to feedback to other similar types of questions that you may have wanted in the past. You're not trying to put it in a broader context necessarily of other issues, other messages, other claims that you may have made. And so it's pretty easy to use a chat or a pretty simple persona in order to get your feedback. Where you want something more rigorous, where you want something that approximates quantitative data, that is structured in a way that you can dig deeper into the way that the analysis was completed, that may be benchmarked against other similar topics or issues, where you want to have a higher degree of confidence. Those are the areas, again, where we do more work now in order to make sure that we're getting the results that we want from this. So you put those things together, and if you end up in a low risk categories for all of these things, then the answer is you write a good prompt, you define the audience in simple or complex terms as you want, and you let the chat go. What we find is that often there is a desire to improve the results, that most of the use cases that we're focused on are in that higher risk category. And then the question becomes, given those risks, how do we make sure that we're doing everything that we can to mitigate the risks and get really good results that would be more likely to be replicable out of the AI in our research? And there are really two different kinds of things that we do in order to do that. The first is we take steps to make our audiences higher fidelity, to really understand what kind of information will benefit the model, will help us get responses that are more likely to be accurate and consistent with human results. And we also take a much more structured research approach so that we have a sense of how these results compare to both human results, but also other results done from synthetic and/or human research. And so let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So here, let's say we wanted to know what DC policy leaders think about Medicare. At a simple level, we can say you're going to act like a DC policy leader, or you're going to act like Republican or Democratic, or a mix of these kinds of policy leaders. We might create a few of those and let the LLM run. We run into these biases that I've talked about already in terms of what's going on with the LLM overall, whether or not the groups that we really want to hear from are effectively represented. how much variance there might be in the audiences, and how much we want to understand about that variance, and what kind of knowledge the base these policy leaders or influencers might have. And so if we don't think that those risks are acceptable and we want to mitigate them, there are things that we can do to build a higher fidelity audience. And there are 5 strategies that we focus on, and we do them. There are a lot of these that you can do through your prompting to build a better audience. So the first one is mitigating the audience. Wow, I only have 5 minutes left. I better get moving. And that is like specifically going after things like sycophancy bias and trying to mitigate that. Say that you should be more skeptical, you should be ruthless. Mitigating sample bias to try and make the profiles that we're looking at closer to real life people, reflecting the real world variance that is in the marketplace, training for response behaviors based on past data, and creating contextual awareness. And I'll give you some examples of what we mean by this. So the first is when we're trying to build a higher fidelity audience, we have the benefit of having done tens, hundreds of thousands of research studies over the years. We have an understanding of what accurate profiles of people look like and what they might not. In your companies, you also have probably profiles of customers or employees, depending on what kind of work you're doing. And so we build these profiles that are based on modeling real data to understand that a 47-year-old who's a college graduate is more likely to have a particular type of income, for example, but mapping them out and building sophisticated demographic personas so that we can then model and create hundreds or thousands of them. From there, we can build a panel for a research study that reflects the audience that we would use in real research. So male-female breakdown, age breakdown, education breakdown. In this case, if it's policy leaders, what kind of jobs they have so that they reflect the kind of research that we would do with real human beings. And then one of the areas that we've found is really important is to understand what kind of intelligence you're giving these people. How much do they know about the kinds of topics that you are testing or the kinds of questions? We find that when we just giving these agents general information, giving them lots of information that may be specific to the individual agent, but is really general to the research objective, doesn't help. We can give 100 different demographic points, and actually it doesn't make things any more accurate. What does make it more accurate in our cases is that we've established a set of behaviors, what we call enhancers and detractors, that we see over and over and over again across topics, across industries, in just the way that humans interpret messaging, and we train our agents on those enhancers and detractors. And so whether it's in the messaging space or some other area, the more sophisticated an understanding you have of human behavior in that particular kind of broad context, the more likely you are to get agents who accurately reflect human behavior when you ask them these questions. I'm going to skip that for purposes of this. And so if you do that, if you start to model out more sophisticated agents, and you can test with hundreds or thousands of agents that each have a persona, have their own demographics, but also really are given these kind of contextual information about how humans respond in these circumstances, then you're much more likely to get accurate results. The second part is about, are we asking the right questions? Are we doing the research in a way that you would do research if you were going to invest in human research? So do we know how these AI responses compare to what humans would say? Do we know how these results compare to other results? Like if you do an ad concept test, if you get a 60% consideration bump, that'd be a lot, but like 60% consider the product afterwards, is that good or bad? What is your research context for understanding um, uh, for understanding the results. And so for that, where we focus is on doing a couple things as researchers that I think are really important, or as important in the synthetic context as they are in a real world context. The first is making sure that the methodology that we use for synthetic research is as rigorous as the research that we would use for human research. In other words, you walk into a focus group or a survey with humans, and you don't really think about what questions you're going to ask, you're not going to get really good outputs. That is at least as true in the context of synthetic research. The second is having some sense of, when you get research back, how does it compare? What are the places that we kind of consistently see humans behaving in the same way versus in different ways? The more confidence that we have in that, the more effectively and efficiently we can do research. But also the methodologies themselves should be validated, right? So if we know that this methodology works with humans, we're going to be more likely to get a methodology that works with synthetic audiences as well. And then finally, having benchmarks that we can use. And here, I think it's been a powerful opportunity for us to kind of leverage the human work that we've done to make sure that when we do this work, we can look at it in the same way as we do synthetic, in the same way as we do human. And so here, just to kind of give you a sense, when we do quantitative research, for example, with humans or with synthetic agents, we can use the same benchmarks to see whether or not a given message is testing well with a given audience. And what we found so far is that we're getting about 90% correlation when we set up the agents based on what we've learned between human studies and synthetic studies. And so when we do just a synthetic study now, we kind of have a sense of how those benchmarks compare to what would be likely be a more expensive, more time-consuming human study. We also have these questions that have been validated over and over again in real research, so that we know that the structure of these questions is effective at getting at the objective that we want. And so I would just say that, like, this is going to be harder for a first timer than it is for a hybrid opportunist or an AI innovator, where you're obviously comfortable with more research methodologies. But it is kind of equally important to say that just kind of throwing out questions is helpful if it's a low risk opportunity. But the higher the risk, the more that you want to rely on these methodologies that you may have used before and just apply them to the synthetic context. And so with that, I'll just kind of summarize what we've talked through. I threw a lot at you, hopefully not too much, too fast, but just that there are a series of questions that you can ask to identify how risky the use case is. Once you've identified that, you can see whether or not it makes sense to just do a kind of a simple prompt-based research, or whether it makes sense to take deliberate steps to create a high-fidelity audience, to use a more structured research approach. And then ultimately, if you do, we see, and we're seeing it pretty consistently now, that synthetic research creates real opportunities to do work that that we would not have done, or to do more of it, really stretch that research dollar. And it's true for just about any kind of audience that you can imagine. I did not get into that, but AI is really good for coming up with audiences, or for targeting audiences that you might not be able to even reach with real research. So with that, let me ask you one final question, if I can. Chris, if you could put up the last question to see how we did. And also, if you have any other questions in the chat, you want to come off mute. I'm not sure if you can come off mute, but if you put it in the chat, would love to take a couple minutes if you have it and talk about that.
Michael, there's a question a little bit further up in the chat from Jared. I don't know if you saw that one or not.
All right. Anybody else? Questions, comments, bad jokes?
Jared was asking,
Thanks,
do you think
Kathy.
synthetic
Appreciate it.
research can be effective?
Yeah, and I looks like we did okay with a couple people. Still feels risky. Happy to talk to people. If you want to talk more and dig into again where there's where we might be able to mitigate the risk or find use cases that just where it just doesn't matter. Thanks, Will. Appreciate it. Bob, we work with predominantly large Fortune 500, broadly speaking, companies across pharma, financial services, energy, tech, consumer. We are really proud of our clients, really large clients, often in regulated industries with sophisticated challenges, and the focus is really on messaging and communication, how to make sure that you can communicate your message effectively. Thank you, John. Appreciate it. And thanks everybody for joining. And really would welcome any further questions that I didn't do a good job with answering. So, hi, Lauren. Thank you. Cool. All right. Well, I hope everybody has a good day. And please feel free to reach out, actually, if we can help.